During the summer of 1997, in a quiet town in Ohio, a young woman went missing without warning, and authorities were left with nothing. But 18 years later, a single discovery changed everything, and it uncovered a truth no one was prepared for. The town of Elmwood sat peacefully nestled among the dense, rolling forests and vast agricultural fields of central Ohio. It was the kind of idyllic, perfectly manicured Midwestern community where families lived in the same neighborhoods for generations, where children rode their bicycles until the streetlights flickered on, and where a deep, heavy sense of neighborly trust permeated every single corner. In the warm, vibrant summer of 1997, Elmwood was thriving, shaking off the heavy rains of spring and settling into a long, comfortable season of backyard barbecues and quiet evening walks. At the very center of this completely ordinary community lived 25-year-old Grace Holloway. Grace was a vibrant, deeply compassionate woman who seemed to naturally radiate a quiet, incredibly steady warmth. She worked as an elementary school art teacher, spending her days completely covered in bright, messy paint, helping young children express themselves. She possessed a rare, entirely genuine empathy that made absolutely everyone around her feel completely seen, heard, and deeply valued. She spent her weekends volunteering at local shelters and community hospitals, always looking for a way to bring a little bit of light into someone else's dark day. Her husband, Nalan, was completely and entirely captivated by her. Nalan was a soft-spoken, incredibly hardworking manager at a local logistics company. He was a man who looked at his wife with a profound, unshakable devotion. They had met in college, instantly bonded over a shared love of quiet weekend mornings and old books, and had been officially married for just 14 months. Their life together was entirely simple and completely beautiful. They had just moved into a small, charming starter house with a wide front porch and a sprawling, overgrown backyard that they planned to slowly renovate. They spent their warm summer evenings painting the interior walls, tending to a small vegetable garden, and talking quietly about the large family they desperately wanted to start. Anyone who knew Grace and Nalan completely believed they were witnessing a love story that would easily last for the next 50 years. But that completely safe, beautiful future was about to be violently, permanently shattered. It was a perfectly ordinary Thursday evening in late July. The air was thick and warm, carrying the heavy, nostalgic scent of freshly cut grass and the faint promise of an impending summer rainstorm. Nalan was sitting at the wooden kitchen table, drinking a glass of iced tea and paying the monthly utility bills. Grace was standing near the front door in the hallway, slipping on her comfortable sandals and grabbing her heavy leather purse from the entryway hook. She turned back to Nalan with a bright, effortless smile. She told him that she needed to quickly drive down to the local neighborhood pharmacy, located just a few miles away in a small, busy commercial strip mall. The next day was Nalan's mother's birthday, and Grace completely wanted to pick up a nice, heartfelt birthday card and a small gift before the store closed for the night. "I'll be home in 20 minutes, Grace promised, her voice carrying absolutely no weight, hesitation, or worry. "Do you want me to grab you anything while I'm there?" Nalan smiled, shook his head, and told her he loved her. It was a completely mundane, entirely typical conversation. Grace pushed the heavy front door open, stepped out into the warm summer evening, and drove away in her silver sedan. She absolutely never came back. 45 minutes slowly passed. Nalan finished paying the bills, neatly stacked the envelopes, and turned on the television in the living room to watch the evening news. He didn't completely panic immediately. He logically assumed she had simply run into a chatty neighbor in the pharmacy greeting card aisle and lost track of time. Grace was incredibly friendly. It wasn't completely unusual for a quick 10-minute errand to stretch slightly longer, because she had stopped to ask someone how their family was doing. An hour passed. The bright summer sun slowly began to dip below the tree line, casting long, heavy shadows across the quiet suburban street outside their living room window. By 8:30 that evening, a tiny, cold seed of confusion in Nolan's chest began to rapidly mutate into a sharp spike of absolute, terrifying worry. He picked up the heavy plastic landline phone on the kitchen wall and quickly dialed the local pharmacy. A bored teenage clerk answered the phone on the second ring. Nolan desperately asked if they had seen a young woman matching Grace's description, bright blonde hair, wearing a yellow summer dress, looking for a birthday card. The clerk heavily sighed, saying they were incredibly busy with the evening rush and hadn't noticed anyone specific. Nolan hung up the phone, grabbed his truck keys, and drove directly to the small strip mall, his heart beginning to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against his ribs. As he pulled into the brightly lit, completely bustling asphalt parking lot, the massive, suffocating reality of the situation completely set in. Grace's silver sedan was sitting quietly in the middle of the parking lot, perfectly neatly parked between two other vehicles under a flickering amber streetlight. Nolan practically jumped out of his truck before he even put it in park, aggressively running over to her car. He pulled desperately on the driver's side door handle. It opened easily. The interior of the vehicle entirely defied all logic. The car was completely empty. There was absolutely no sign of a violent struggle. There was no shattered glass on the pavement, no blood on the upholstery, and absolutely no indication that she had been violently forced from the driver's seat against her will. But as Nolan frantically searched the interior of the car, he noticed two completely baffling, highly terrifying details. Sitting perfectly upright on the passenger seat was Grace's leather purse. He reached inside with trembling hands. Her wallet, her driver's license, and her cash were entirely untouched. But her car keys were completely missing from the ignition. Nolan ran completely frantically into the pharmacy, his face pale and his breathing ragged. He desperately searched the aisles, aggressively asking every single employee and customer if they had seen her. Nobody completely remembered seeing a young woman matching her description. The manager checked the cash registers. Grace had never made a purchase. She had never even made it to the checkout counter. By 10 o'clock that night, an exhausted, profoundly terrified Nolan walked into the local county police precinct and officially filed a highly urgent missing persons report. Because Grace was a responsible adult with absolutely no history of mental illness, depression, or substance abuse, the night shift desk sergeant initially treated the situation with a deeply frustrating lack of urgency. They heavily suggested she might simply need some space, or that the overwhelming pressure of a new marriage had caused her to temporarily walk away to clear her head. But Nolan fiercely, aggressively pushed back. He completely knew his wife. He knew that the profound love they shared was entirely genuine, and Grace would absolutely never, ever vanish into the night without a single word, leaving her identification behind. The following morning, as the local news stations began broadcasting Grace's face across the county, the massive, aggressive investigation officially began. The local detectives heavily examined the strip mall parking lot in the harsh daylight. In 1997, highly prevalent outdoor security cameras simply did not exist in quiet Midwestern towns. There was absolutely no surveillance footage of the parking lot. Despite canvassing the surrounding stores, there were no witnesses who came forward to say they saw a woman being violently dragged into another vehicle. It looked exactly as if Grace had simply parked her car, removed the keys, left her purse behind, and completely vanished into thin air. The entire psychological profile of the massive investigation was incredibly fractured. The police were completely forced to consider absolutely every possibility. They initially heavily considered a voluntary disappearance, but a woman who leaves her purse, her identification, and all her money completely sitting on the passenger seat is absolutely not running away to start a new life. She couldn't board a plane, rent an apartment, or even buy a tank of gas. They aggressively completely considered a random abduction. But abducting a grown woman from a highly busy, heavily lit commercial parking lot in the early evening without a single witness seeing or hearing a struggle was entirely unlikely. And naturally, as is standard procedure in every domestic disappearance, they heavily turned their investigative spotlight directly onto Nolan himself. The detectives brought the deeply grieving husband into the sterile interrogation room. They relentlessly pressed him for hours, completely trying to break his story, searching for any hidden signs of marital abuse or financial trouble. But Nolan's physical alibi was absolutely flawless. Several neighbors completely confirmed they had seen him sitting at his kitchen table through the front window during the exact window of time Grace had completely vanished. He fully cooperated, provided his financial records, and completely passed a highly rigorous polygraph test. He was legally completely cleared as a suspect, but the heavy, brutal shadow of public suspicion entirely isolated him in the quiet community. The devastating whispers started in the grocery store aisles and local diners. Days turned into weeks. Weeks slowly dragged into heavy, agonizing months. There was absolutely no ransom demand. There was no physical evidence recovered from the car. The massive search parties that had scoured the local woods, the deep ravines, and the nearby lakes entirely failed to find a single trace of her. Grace Holloway completely became one of the most frustrating, profoundly heartbreaking missing person cases in the entire history of the state. The years began to aggressively pass. The bright, vibrant summer of 1997 eventually completely faded into a heavy, distant memory. The massive missing person flyers completely peeled off the telephone poles in the freezing Ohio winters. Grace's friends eventually moved away, building the exact beautiful families that Grace had so desperately wanted. Even the deeply dedicated investigators eventually retired, entirely passing the heavily archived, profoundly frustrating cold case file down to younger detectives who had never met the young bride. The case entirely slipped into the growing stack of unsolved disappearances, gathering dust in the dark basement of the police precinct. But Nolan fiercely refused to stop looking. He entirely refused to sell their small house. He kept her heavy winter coats perfectly hung in the closet. He lived as a deeply broken, entirely exhausted ghost, entirely consumed by the massive, unrelenting silence that had entirely stolen his beautiful wife. To completely cope with the massive, suffocating grief, Nolan developed a highly quiet, deeply solitary hobby. Over the years, he began attending local estate sales and rural auctions, completely collecting heavily faded local history books, old postcards, and completely forgotten vintage photographs. He completely found a strange, quiet comfort in preserving the forgotten memories of other people, since his own beautiful memories had been completely stolen. 18 incredibly long, profoundly agonizing years passed. It was now the late summer of 2015. Nolan was a much older, deeply weathered man in his mid-40s. The massive, entirely unrelenting silence of the past 18 years had completely defined his entire existence. Before we continue, if you enjoy real missing person mysteries like this, please subscribe. It really helps our channel grow. It was a completely ordinary, quiet Saturday morning. Nolan drove to a neighboring Ohio town, nearly 40 miles away from Elmwood, to attend a large, heavily advertised estate sale at a deeply old, heavily decaying suburban home. He walked quietly through the crowded rooms, heavily avoiding the antique furniture and the expensive silverware that drew the largest crowds. He entirely gravitated toward a small, dusty cardboard box sitting quietly on the floor in the corner of a back bedroom. The box was completely filled with hundreds of heavily faded, entirely forgotten family photographs. Nolan purchased the entire box for $5. He completely expected it to simply contain forgotten birthdays, faded family vacations, and completely unknown faces frozen in time. He drove back to his quiet house, made a cup of coffee, and sat at his wooden kitchen table. He began slowly, completely meticulously sorting through the heavy stack of old photographs. Most of the pictures were completely entirely unremarkable. They showed smiling children covered in cake, heavily decorated Christmas trees, and quiet summer picnics at local parks. But as Nolan pulled a slightly larger, highly glossy photograph from the very bottom of the heavy stack, his entire body went entirely cold. His heart completely stopped beating in his chest. A massive, suffocating wave of profound shock entirely crushed his lungs. The photograph was a completely candid shot taken at a deeply crowded, highly chaotic backyard birthday party. Dozens of people were standing on a bright green lawn, talking and laughing while a child blew out candles in the foreground. But Nolan entirely ignored the smiling child and the bright balloons. His eyes were completely locked onto the deep background of the photograph. Standing completely still near the edge of the frame, entirely separated from the celebrating crowd, was a woman. It was Grace. Nolan completely collapsed against the table, heavily grasping the small photograph in his trembling hands. He completely wept, violently sobbing with a raw, agonizing devastation. He pulled a heavy magnifying glass from his kitchen drawer and completely aggressively examined the small, heavily detailed face. There was absolutely no mistake. It wasn't a woman who simply looked like her. It was completely his beautiful wife. But the most completely terrifying, deeply chilling detail was exactly how she was entirely behaving in the photograph. She was absolutely not smiling. She was entirely not looking at the party, the cake, or the happy people surrounding her. Grace was looking completely directly into the camera lens. Her eyes were deeply hollow, completely exhausted, and profoundly determined. And the completely terrifying reality was heavily printed directly on the white border of the photograph itself. The bright blue timestamp completely proved the picture was taken in late October of 1997. The photograph had been entirely captured nearly 3 entire months after Grace Holloway had officially completely vanished from the face of the earth. Nolan Holloway sat completely frozen at his wooden kitchen table, the small, highly glossy photograph trembling violently in his hands. The massive, suffocating silence of the past 18 years had entirely shattered in a single, completely impossible second. He stared at the face of his beautiful wife, completely ignoring the smiling children, the bright balloons, and the birthday cake in the foreground. Grace was not smiling. Her vibrant eyes were completely hollow, deeply exhausted, and filled with a profound, quiet desperation. He didn't hesitate. He didn't even stop to completely catch his breath. Nolan aggressively grabbed his truck keys and drove at 80 miles an hour directly to the Elmwood Police Precinct. He violently burst through the heavy glass doors of the station, entirely demanding to speak with the Cold Case Division. A deeply experienced, highly methodical investigator named Detective Holden completely took charge of the chaotic situation. When Nolan slammed the small photograph onto the metal desk, Holden initially looked at it with a heavy, deeply practiced skepticism. "Mr. Holloway," Detective Holden said gently, his voice completely calm, "it has been 18 incredibly long years. The mind can completely play terrible tricks on us, especially when we are desperate for answers. It is entirely possible this is simply a young woman in a neighboring town who deeply resembles your wife." "That is my wife," Nolan wept, his voice cracking violently with a raw, agonizing certainty. "I completely know her face. I know exactly how she stands, and the bright blue date stamped on the white border says October of 1997. She was completely alive 3 months after you all entirely gave up looking for her. Detective Holden immediately completely realized the massive, unprecedented gravity of the photograph. If the timestamp was completely accurate, the entire psychological profile of the massive cold case was fundamentally, entirely wrong. Grace had absolutely not been randomly murdered in the pharmacy parking lot. She had completely survived the summer. The state crime scene technicians aggressively took possession of the photograph. Detective Holden completely refused to simply trust the blue ink printed on the paper border. He heavily contacted a highly specialized forensic photography expert to deeply analyze the physical-chemical makeup of the photo paper and the development processing code stamped faintly on the back. 48 hours later, the official forensic report completely shattered all remaining doubt. The film development code entirely matched a specific batch of processing chemicals used by a regional photo lab during the exact autumn of 1997. The forensic expert completely eliminated the absolute possibility that the picture had been mislabeled, digitally altered, or completely accidentally stamped with the wrong year. Grace Holloway had been completely undeniably alive, standing in a sunny backyard nearly 3 entire months after she officially vanished. Detective Holden aggressively launched a massive, highly energized reinvestigation. The absolute first critical step was to completely identify exactly where the photograph was taken and who had hosted the crowded birthday party. Because Nolan had completely purchased the dusty box of photographs at a public estate sale, the detectives aggressively traced the physical address of the event. The heavily decaying suburban home was located in a neighboring Ohio town, nearly 40 miles completely away from where Grace had originally disappeared. The estate belonged to a deeply elderly couple named the Harpers, who had recently moved into an assisted living facility. Their adult children were completely available for questioning, having just sold off the family's old belongings. Detective Holden brought the family into the sterile police precinct. He gently placed the small, highly glossy photograph completely across the metal table, aggressively asking them to identify the young woman standing in the deep background. The adult children looked at the picture, completely deeply confused. "That is my younger brother's 7th birthday party," the oldest daughter heavily explained, her voice entirely shaking as she looked at the image. "It was hosted in our backyard in October of 1997, but I have absolutely no idea who that woman in the background is." The entire family completely confirmed the terrifying reality. Absolutely none of them completely remembered Grace being at the party. She was not a relative, she was not a family friend, and she was entirely not a neighbor. Even stranger, when Detective Holden aggressively asked exactly who had been physically holding the camera to take the specific picture, the family was entirely completely baffled. "There were dozens of people completely walking around that afternoon," the daughter whispered. "People were just entirely casually picking up the disposable cameras from the picnic table and snapping random pictures. Nobody completely remembers taking this specific shot." The massive, completely overwhelming realization violently washed over the investigation. Grace was entirely completely hiding in plain sight at a crowded suburban party where absolutely nobody knew her name. Detective Holden completely realized that if they wanted to absolutely understand exactly how Grace got into that backyard, they deeply needed to completely find the absolute original 35mm negative strip. A physical negative would prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that the image was completely authentic and untouched. The Harper family heavily explained that their father's close friend, an older man named Arthur, had been the one who routinely gathered all the cameras after neighborhood parties and dropped them off at the developer. But the brutal, incredibly relentless cruelty of time violently struck the massive investigation once again. Arthur had officially completely passed away from a massive heart attack nearly 10 years earlier. The detectives entirely refused to let the trail go cold. They aggressively secured a heavy search warrant for the late photographer's old, completely abandoned storage unit on the edge of town, where his widow had heavily packed all of his old belongings into dozens of cardboard boxes and completely forgotten about them. Heavily armed state police and forensic technicians spent 3 deeply exhausting, profoundly agonizing days meticulously completely sorting through thousands of highly fragile, entirely unorganized strips of analog film negatives. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, a highly trained forensic technician completely found it. Sitting entirely hidden inside a small, heavily faded yellow envelope was the absolute original negative strip from the October 1997 birthday party. Detective Holden and Nolan stood in the completely dark, highly secure photographic laboratory at the State Command Center. The lead audiovisual technician carefully completely loaded the incredibly fragile negative strip into a massive, highly advanced digital scanner. The machine aggressively processed the raw, unaltered film, completely projecting the massive, highly detailed images onto a large computer monitor in the dark room. The original negative completely undeniably proved that the photograph was absolutely real. There was entirely no manipulation. There was no darkroom trickery. Grace Holloway was physically, completely standing in that Ohio backyard. As the massive, highly detailed image completely filled the bright screen, Detective Holden leaned heavily forward, his eyes entirely completely locked onto Grace's posture. "Wait," Holden whispered quietly, his voice carrying a sudden, incredibly sharp intensity. "Zoom in completely on her right hand." The technician aggressively magnified the massive image, entirely isolating Grace's lower body. She was absolutely not simply standing idly in the grass. Her right hand was heavily, partially hidden directly behind her small leather purse. But as the digital pixels completely cleared, the terrifying, highly calculated reality became undeniably obvious. Grace's index finger was completely extended. She was subtly, entirely deliberately pointing her hand directly toward the extreme right edge of the photograph, physically gesturing toward something completely outside the visible frame. She wasn't just completely staring at the camera. She was desperately, aggressively completely trying to leave a highly physical, deeply intentional clue. She entirely completely knew the picture was being taken. Nolan wept, his entire body trembling violently with a raw, agonizing pride. She completely positioned herself to send a message. To completely prove this massive theory, Detective Holden aggressively ordered the technician to digitally scan the exact 2 photographs that had been taken completely entirely seconds before the birthday cake shot. The technician loaded the preceding frames. Frame number 22 completely showed the children heavily gathering around the picnic table. The deep green grass in the background was entirely completely empty. Frame number 23 completely showed the mother lighting the birthday candles. The deep background was still absolutely, completely empty. And then in frame number 24, the absolute final picture in the sequence, Grace was suddenly there. She absolutely had not been standing in the background the entire time. The original negatives completely proved that Grace had intentionally, aggressively stepped directly into the camera's precise view at the absolute last possible microscopic second before the shutter violently clicked. She had deliberately completely photobombed the family picture because she entirely knew that eventually, years in the future, the film would be developed, and someone might finally completely realize she was still alive. She was desperately shouting into the future without making a single sound. The massive, terrifying question completely entirely consumed the state task force. Why was she pointing? What was she desperately completely trying to show them outside the frame? Detective Holden entirely realized that Grace would absolutely not have been allowed to walk around a crowded party completely alone if she was being violently held captive. The monster completely holding her absolutely had to be standing just outside the camera's view, completely unaware that Grace had stepped into the shot. The state police aggressively completely brought the host family back into the precinct. They heavily laid out every single printed photograph from the entire roll of film across the massive metal table. "We need you to completely identify every single human being in these pictures," Holden aggressively demanded. "I completely do not care if it takes all night. Look at the edges of the frames. Look at the people standing in the shadows." For 6 deeply exhausting hours, the family meticulously completely named every child, every neighbor, and every distant cousin captured in the photographs. They successfully completely identified absolutely everyone in attendance, completely except for one single, highly mysterious person. In the deep background of a different photograph taken earlier in the afternoon, heavily obscured by the shadow of a large oak tree, stood an older, deeply plain-looking woman. She was wearing a heavy gray sweater, her hair pulled back tightly. She completely lacked any defining physical features, looking entirely like a completely ordinary, harmless grandmother. "Who is that woman?" Holden asked, pointing aggressively at the older figure. The family looked completely, heavily confused. "We entirely don't know her full name," the mother of the birthday boy heavily explained, her voice completely shaking. "She was absolutely not officially invited. She had simply quietly arrived as a +1 with another neighbor who lived down the street. She barely spoke to absolutely anyone all afternoon." Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. "Did she stay for the cake?" Holden asked, his heart completely pounding a frantic rhythm. "No," the mother whispered, delivering the absolute, completely terrifying detail that entirely changed the investigation. "She abruptly completely left the party right before we brought the cake out. She looked highly nervous, and she completely rushed away with the younger woman." She had entirely rushed away because she completely realized Grace had intentionally stepped into the camera frame. The older woman had seen the flash, violently panicked, and aggressively dragged Grace out of the backyard before anyone could ask questions. The invisible phantom who had completely taken Grace Holloway was absolutely not a violent male drifter. It was not a highly aggressive ex-boyfriend, and it was entirely completely not her husband. The monster holding her captive was a deeply quiet, completely ordinary older woman who had entirely vanished into the dark before the candles were even blown out. And as Detective Holden heavily stared at the older woman's completely blurry face in the shadows, he entirely realized that the terrifying mystery was only absolutely just beginning. The terrifying revelation that the phantom was an older, completely ordinary-looking woman aggressively sent the Elmwood Task Force scrambling for answers. Detective Holden entirely knew that to completely find Grace, they absolutely had to identify the mysterious older woman who had quietly slipped away from that suburban birthday party. The detectives aggressively tracked down the specific neighbor who had brought the older woman to the party as a +1 guest 18 years earlier. The neighbor, now a highly elderly woman living in a quiet nursing home, was deeply cooperative but entirely completely unhelpful regarding the mystery woman's true, legal identity. "I completely met her at a local community center just a few weeks before that party," the elderly neighbor heavily explained, her voice entirely completely shaking with age. "She told me her name was Margaret. She was incredibly polite, deeply quiet, and completely seemed harmless. She said she was new to the area and entirely lonely. I absolutely completely just thought I was being nice by inviting her to a neighborhood gathering." Detective Holden leaned completely across the table. Did Margaret ever completely mention exactly where she lived or where she worked? She completely rented a small house on the edge of town, the neighbor recalled. But she was absolutely completely gone just 2 days after that birthday party. I went to her house to check on her, and it was entirely completely empty. She left absolutely no forwarding address. She just completely vanished. The massive state task force immediately completely pivoted. Holden aggressively completely subpoenaed the historical property rental records for the specific house the older woman had occupied in the autumn of 1997. The property management company heavily completely provided the original, deeply archived analog lease agreement. The name on the heavy paper lease was absolutely not Margaret. The tenant had officially signed the legal document using the name Martha Gable. Holden aggressively ran the name through the massive state motor vehicle database, the federal tax records, and the completely modernized national criminal registries. The highly complex algorithms returned a completely baffling, absolutely terrifying hit. The name Martha Gable was deeply, entirely tied to multiple short-term rental leases entirely scattered across the entire state of Ohio completely throughout the late 1990s. But in absolutely every single instance, the lease was aggressively completely abandoned suddenly, entirely without warning. The older woman had entirely rented several deeply isolated, highly quiet properties across Ohio, completely using different, slightly altered versions of the exact same last name. She was absolutely a highly intelligent, completely invisible phantom who lived entirely completely off the federal grid, constantly aggressively relocating to completely avoid detection. But as Detective Holden meticulously completely reviewed the dozens of abandoned rental histories, a highly specific, deeply terrifying pattern completely emerged. He heavily completely tracked down one of the former landlords who had rented a deeply isolated rural house to the older woman in the early spring of 1998, nearly 6 months after the birthday photograph was taken. The former landlord completely clearly remembered the deeply quiet tenant. She always completely paid the rent entirely in pure cash on the exact first of the month, the landlord heavily explained, sitting nervously across from Detective Holden. But there was absolutely completely something deeply unusual about her. What was entirely unusual? Holden aggressively demanded. She absolutely never lived completely alone, the landlord whispered, delivering a massive, profoundly, completely chilling detail. She always entirely lived with a deeply quiet, highly reserved younger relative. The younger woman absolutely almost never entirely spoke to the neighbors. She completely kept her head down, heavily avoiding eye contact. The older woman completely controlled exactly when the younger girl left the house, and who she was absolutely entirely allowed to speak to. The state task force aggressively, completely tracked the physical address of the specific former rental house the landlord had explicitly mentioned. Heavily armed state police violently completely descended on the quiet suburban street, deeply canvassing the neighborhood for any entirely completely forgotten memories from the late 90s. A deeply elderly couple who still lived completely directly across the street from the abandoned rental property heavily provided the absolute, undeniable physical confirmation the detectives were desperately completely looking for. I entirely completely remember the younger woman, the elderly neighbor stated firmly, her voice entirely completely confident. I saw her entirely completely hanging heavy, wet laundry in the backyard on a bright Tuesday afternoon. When Detective Holden gently completely slid the small, highly glossy photograph of Grace directly across the table, the elderly neighbor completely entirely broke down. That is absolutely completely the young woman who was hanging the laundry, the neighbor wept, entirely confirming the massive reality. But just a few weeks completely after I saw her in the backyard, the house was entirely completely empty. They both absolutely completely disappeared in the middle of the dark night. Grace had completely entirely survived the bitter winter of 1997. She was completely physically alive, heavily living in quiet suburban neighborhoods, entirely completely hiding in plain sight while her husband entirely deeply believed she was lost in the dark. Driven by the massive, completely overwhelming proof of life, Detective Holden completely entirely realized they absolutely needed to heavily completely understand exactly how the older woman had originally completely targeted Grace before the initial disappearance in Elmwood. The detectives aggressively completely audited the heavily restricted historical analog phone records from the local elementary school, where Grace had completely entirely worked as an art teacher in 1997. The massive telecom servers completely revealed a deeply terrifying, entirely completely hidden secret. During the incredibly tense, highly specific week completely entirely leading up to her terrifying disappearance from the pharmacy parking lot, someone had repeatedly, aggressively completely called Grace's private classroom extension. The heavy analog trace entirely completely proved that the secret phone calls had absolutely not come from a home address or a registered cellular phone. Every single terrifying call had been heavily placed from a heavy public pay phone. And when the state police entirely completely tracked the exact physical coordinates of that specific public pay phone, the massive, deeply chilling geographical connection was completely undeniable. The pay phone was located absolutely completely less than a single mile directly down the street from one of the incredibly quiet, completely isolated rental houses the older woman had briefly occupied just weeks before Grace vanished. The older woman had entirely completely targeted the young art teacher. She had aggressively, deeply manipulated her, entirely completely calling her at work, silently drawing her directly into a highly specific, completely terrifying psychological trap. To completely understand exactly how the older woman had entirely gained Grace's deep trust, Detective Holden gently completely asked Nolan to bring absolutely every single personal item Grace had completely entirely left behind in their small house. Nolan carefully completely carried a heavy, sealed plastic storage bin from the attic. Inside were Grace's old college textbooks, heavily faded art supplies, and completely personal notebooks. Deeply completely hidden at the absolute very bottom of the heavy bin, Holden completely found Grace's small, heavily worn leather journal from the early summer of 1997. He carefully entirely opened the heavily fragile pages, completely aggressively reading her highly private, deeply emotional entries. In a completely forgotten, incredibly quiet entry written just 2 weeks absolutely completely before she vanished, Grace had entirely documented a highly specific, deeply fateful encounter. I met a deeply kind, incredibly exhausted elderly woman today while I was completely volunteering at the local community hospital, Grace had beautifully, heavily written. She looked entirely completely lost and profoundly lonely in the waiting room. She entirely told me she had absolutely no family left to help her. I completely offered to sit with her for a while. We talked for over an hour. She deeply completely needed someone to simply entirely listen to her. The physical description of the kind elderly woman in the heavy journal entry completely entirely perfectly matched the deeply mysterious, highly manipulative older tenant. Detective Holden immediately aggressively completely subpoenaed the heavily restricted historical volunteer visitor logs from the local community hospital for the exact specific date completely entirely mentioned in Grace's journal. The massive hospital archives completely entirely provided the terrifying, absolute final truth of the older woman's incredibly dark deception. The older woman had absolutely completely never been a registered hospital volunteer. She was not a patient, and she was entirely completely not an employee. According to the heavily restricted visitor logs, The older woman had been physically completely sitting in that hospital waiting room actively, entirely completely visiting a heavily injured patient under a completely different, entirely heavily falsified identity. She had intentionally, completely deliberately placed herself in the hospital waiting room to entirely completely project a highly vulnerable, deeply harmless persona, aggressively targeting deeply compassionate, entirely empathetic young women who naturally completely gravitated toward helping those in need. And as the massive state task force heavily completely fed the older woman's various falsified names and deeply hidden rental addresses into the highly modernized federal missing persons databases, the absolute true, terrifying scope of the nightmare violently, entirely, completely washed over the command center. The massive federal computer completely returned multiple, highly terrifying matches. The cold case suddenly, aggressively, entirely, completely became much, much larger. Investigators heavily entirely discovered that several different young missing women completely entirely from neighboring states had absolutely all crossed physical paths with that exact same older woman in hospitals, quiet community centers, and local churches shortly completely before entirely disappearing into the dark. The Phantom was absolutely completely not a random kidnapper. She was a deeply sophisticated, highly manipulative predator who specifically entirely completely targeted fiercely compassionate women, entirely completely pulling them into a massive, highly terrifying psychological web of control, fear, and deep isolation. Grace Holloway was absolutely completely entirely not her only victim, but she was the absolute only one incredibly brave enough to completely intentionally step directly into a birthday photograph, to completely entirely completely send a massive signal to the world. The state police aggressively launched a massive forensic sweep of the specific abandoned rental house, where the elderly neighbor had completely witnessed Grace hanging laundry in the backyard. Heavily armed crime scene technicians completely tore the empty suburban house apart. They meticulously entirely scoured the heavy floorboards, the deeply dusty air vents, and the dark corners of the small closets. Deeply hidden in the heavy trap piece of a bathroom sink drain, the forensic team completely recovered a single, incredibly long strand of hair. When the state laboratory aggressively processed the microscopic genetic material, the massive, undeniable truth completely cemented the entire timeline. The DNA absolutely, perfectly matched Grace Holloway. She had completely, definitely been living inside that specific house, physically alive, many months after she had completely vanished from the pharmacy parking lot. Before we continue, if you want more emotional cold case stories like this, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. But the deeply quiet, entirely abandoned house completely held another massive, profoundly heartbreaking secret. Just weeks before the state police arrived to search the property, the current owner had heavily hired a local construction crew to completely renovate the decaying house. While tearing down the heavy, water-damaged drywall in a small back bedroom, the workers had completely discovered something deeply strange, heavily hidden inside the dark wall cavity. They had entirely found a small, heavy stack of completely folded, incredibly fragile pieces of paper. Detective Holden carefully completely unfolded the papers on the metal table at the precinct. They were entirely absolutely children's drawings, heavily colored with cheap, thick crayons. The drawings completely depicted bright, sunny days, small houses, and stick-figure families. But one highly specific, incredibly poignant sketch completely shattered the detective's heart. It was a beautiful, entirely deeply careful drawing of a young woman with bright yellow hair. She was completely holding the hand of a small child. The woman in the heavy crayon drawing was smiling deeply, and printed incredibly neatly in large, uneven childlike letters beneath her feet was a single, absolute word. Grace. Detective Holden immediately aggressively completely realized that the older woman was absolutely not just holding vulnerable women captive. She was heavily moving entire families, completely bringing small children into her massive, dark web of psychological control. The state task force entirely used historical school enrollment records and old pediatric dental files to completely trace the young children who had briefly lived in that specific suburban neighborhood in 1998. They finally completely located the specific child who had drawn the picture. She was now a young, deeply successful woman in her late 20s, living quietly entirely out of state. When Detective Holden completely gently brought her back to Ohio and showed her the heavy, faded crayon drawing, the young woman completely broke down in the sterile interrogation room. She wept with a profound, heavy agony, completely entirely remembering the beautiful young woman who had entirely saved her spirit. "I completely remember her as Miss Grace," the young woman cried, her voice heavily shaking in the quiet room. "I was only a little girl. My mother had brought me to that older woman because she completely promised to hide us from my violent father. But the older woman was incredibly strict, deeply terrifying, and completely kept us locked inside the house." The young woman wiped her heavy tears, delivering a completely incredibly beautiful, highly devastating memory of the young bride. "Miss Grace was the absolute only light in that dark house," the young woman whispered. "Whenever the older woman would completely leave the house to buy groceries or run errands, Miss Grace would quietly rush into our room. She completely held us. She sang deeply quiet songs to us. She entirely completely secretly comforted all the frightened children when the older woman wasn't watching." Grace Holloway had absolutely completely entirely refused to let the heavy darkness destroy her beautiful heart. Even while completely entirely trapped in a massive psychological prison, she had spent her agonizing days, fiercely, entirely protecting the innocence of the children completely trapped alongside her. "She used to wait until it was completely dark," the young woman wept, heavily clutching the crayon drawing. "She would entirely kneel by my small bed, completely whispering that I had to be brave. She whispered that she had a deeply beautiful husband, and she entirely promised me that someone would completely come looking for her one day. She absolutely never stopped entirely believing he would find her." But the young woman's completely beautiful memory suddenly turned deeply, entirely terrifying. She heavily revealed that Grace had completely aggressively attempted to escape the massive psychological web. "The older woman took us all to a massive, incredibly crowded rural county fair in the late summer of 1998, the young woman explained, completely entirely shivering with the heavy memory. "It was incredibly loud and deeply chaotic. Miss Grace completely saw an opening. She quietly told me to entirely stay put, and she aggressively made a sudden, desperate run completely directly toward the heavy gravel parking lot, desperately trying to find a police officer." "Did she completely make it?" Holden aggressively demanded, his heart violently pounding. "I don't completely know," the young woman cried. "She completely disappeared into the massive, heavy crowd. I absolutely never saw her again. The older woman completely rushed us back to the car and heavily entirely told us that Miss Grace had simply gotten confused and walked away. I entirely completely thought she had abandoned us." Grace had completely attempted a massive, incredibly brave physical escape in broad daylight. But absolutely, no official police report had ever been completely filed that day, completely meaning she had entirely failed to reach the authorities before the older woman, or someone deeply working with her, completely intercepted her. Detective Holden immediately aggressively subpoenaed the highly restricted historical archives of the local newspaper that had completely covered that specific rural county fair in 1998. The state technicians heavily spent hours completely meticulously scrolling through hundreds of incredibly grainy, highly degraded microfiche rolls, aggressively completely searching the background of absolutely every single crowd photograph entirely published that weekend. Deeply completely buried on the fourth page of the Sunday edition, completely hidden in the dense background of a photograph heavily focused on a large Ferris wheel, the state police entirely found her. The heavily blurred, highly grainy image completely undeniably captured Grace Holloway. She was completely looking frantically over her shoulder, aggressively entirely pushing through the massive crowd, desperately running toward the edge of the frame. It completely officially became the absolute second confirmed, completely entirely undeniable physical sighting of Grace alive after her massive disappearance. When Detective Holden gently completely brought Nolan back into the precinct to completely identify the newly discovered newspaper photograph, the deeply exhausted husband entirely pointed out a massive, highly specific microscopic detail that the highly trained state police had completely entirely missed. "Look at her neck," Nolan wept, heavily pressing his trembling finger completely against the small digital screen. Holden aggressively, completely zoomed the image. In both the incredibly clear birthday party photograph and the heavily blurred, highly chaotic county fair photograph, Grace was entirely completely wearing a tiny, incredibly delicate silver pendant heavily resting against her collarbone. "That is the absolute exact necklace I gave her completely on our wedding day," Nolan cried, completely sobbing with a massive, profound devastation. The heavy, incredibly beautiful reality entirely completely washed over the investigation. Grace had absolutely completely never willingly abandoned her old life. She had heavily fiercely held onto the single physical completely remaining piece of her marriage, entirely wearing it every single day as a massive shield against the heavy darkness closing in completely around her. Driven by this massive, entirely undeniable proof of her absolute struggle, the state task force aggressively, completely pivoted heavily toward the older woman's highly hidden financial infrastructure. Detective Holden completely entirely knew that the older woman absolutely could not afford to completely rent dozens of properties in pure cash and entirely completely support multiple hidden women without a massive, highly secure source of external funding. The state financial investigators heavily completely entirely audited the deeply archived, highly complex banking records connected to the older woman's various falsified identities. They completely aggressively traced a series of heavy, completely consistent anonymous money orders that had been quietly entirely mailed to the older woman every single month throughout the late 1990s. When the highly advanced federal algorithm finally completely entirely cracked the routing numbers on the original money orders, the massive, completely terrifying truth violently entirely shattered the entire investigation. The heavy, consistent payments completely entirely originated from a highly secure private bank account completely located right inside the town of Elmwood. The deeply hidden, highly secretive financial benefactor heavily completely lived absolutely completely right down the street from where Grace had originally vanished. And when Detective Holden completely read the official name completely registered to the deeply hidden bank account, his blood entirely ran completely cold. The massive payments completely came from a highly respected, deeply wealthy local businessman named Robert Sterling. Robert Sterling was entirely completely a pillar of the Elmwood community. But the most incredibly terrifying, deeply sick detail was his massive public involvement in the original disappearance. In the agonizing weeks completely immediately following Grace's highly terrifying disappearance in 1997, Sterling had completely entirely stood on the steps of the local courthouse with a heavy bullhorn. He had aggressively, publicly donated massive amounts of his own money to heavily fund the completely helpless search parties desperately completely looking for her. He was physically, actively heavily funding the massive search for Grace Holloway while simultaneously completely secretly sending massive amounts of untraceable cash directly to the exact woman who was entirely completely holding her captive. Heavily armed state police violently completely descended on the businessman's massive, sprawling suburban estate. They entirely kicked the heavy mahogany doors open, aggressively placing the deeply shocked, highly arrogant man completely in heavy steel handcuffs. When Sterling was aggressively dragged completely into the sterile interrogation room, he sweat profusely, his entirely confident facade completely heavily cracking under Detective Holden's incredibly furious gaze. Holden violently, entirely slammed the heavy stack of completely traced financial money orders completely across the metal table. "You completely entirely paid her," Holden aggressively yelled, his voice completely echoing in the quiet room. "You entirely funded the absolute nightmare. Where is Grace Holloway?" Sterling completely broke, heavily entirely weeping with a massive, profoundly cowardly desperation. "I absolutely completely didn't know Grace was a missing person," the businessman heavily entirely cried, his voice violently completely cracking. "I swear to God, I completely entirely thought I was doing something deeply heroic." Sterling entirely completely confessed to heavily knowing the older woman, but he aggressively, deeply completely insisted that she had entirely manipulated him just as heavily as she had manipulated the victims. "She completely entirely told me she was running a highly secretive, deeply underground railroad for highly vulnerable women heavily desperately entirely escaping severely abusive homes," Sterling wept. "She entirely convinced me that if I heavily completely funded her operation, I would be entirely secretly completely saving innocent lives. Whenever she completely entirely sent me heavily disguised photographs of the women she rescued, she completely told me their abusive husbands were incredibly dangerous cops or wealthy politicians. She completely told me the young art teacher in the pictures was a heavily abused victim deeply hiding under a completely new identity." Detective Holden stared completely heavily at the weeping businessman. The state police were absolutely completely not entirely convinced by his convenient, deeply cowardly excuse. He had completely entirely funded a massive, highly abusive psychological captivity, ring entirely under the deeply sick guise of secret charity. Holden aggressively, entirely, completely demanded full, absolute access to the businessman's massive commercial holdings. Heavily armed state troopers violently completely executed a massive search warrant on a deeply isolated, heavily secured commercial storage warehouse entirely owned by Sterling on the dark edge of the county. The massive warehouse was completely deeply entirely filled with heavy dust and deeply overwhelming silence. As the forensic technicians aggressively completely tore through the massive rows of locked metal cages, they completely discovered a profoundly horrifying, deeply entirely devastating cache of physical evidence. Deeply completely hidden in the absolute back corner of the warehouse were dozens of heavy, completely sealed plastic storage bins. Inside the heavy bins were the entirely completely stolen, highly private old lives of the missing women. The older woman had aggressively completely entirely stripped them of their true identities and heavily mailed their physical belongings to the businessman to completely hide the deeply terrifying physical evidence from any landlords. Holden frantically, completely entirely tore through the heavy plastic boxes, completely searching for absolutely any sign of Grace. Inside a heavily dusty box completely falsely labeled with a heavily assumed name, Holden entirely completely found a massive stack of highly ordinary grocery lists and incredibly mundane household notes. The state handwriting experts instantly completely entirely confirmed the deeply devastating truth. The heavy, highly distinct handwriting completely perfectly matched Grace Holloway. She had been completely forced to live heavily entirely as someone else, completely stripped of her beautiful name. Before we continue, if you want more emotional cold case stories like this, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. But completely entirely buried at the absolute very bottom of the heavy plastic box, completely hidden inside a heavily worn winter glove, Holden completely entirely found the most massive, highly critical piece of evidence in the entire investigation. It was a tiny, incredibly cheap disposable camera. It had completely been entirely forgotten by the older woman when she heavily packed the box to be hidden away. The state darkroom technicians completely entirely rushed to deeply develop the highly fragile, nearly destroyed film inside the tiny plastic camera. When the heavily processed photographs finally flashed entirely onto the bright digital monitor, they revealed Grace completely entirely alive nearly a full year completely after her initial disappearance. She looked entirely heavily thinner. Her bright face was entirely weathered by the massive, completely suffocating stress of the psychological torture, but her completely vibrant eyes were absolutely fierce with a deep, entirely undeniable determination. She had entirely used the heavily hidden camera to secretly photograph the heavily worn wooden porch of the massive, deeply isolated rural property, where she was completely being held. But it was the completely final photograph entirely left on the fragile roll of film that completely blew the massive investigation violently wide open. Grace had entirely leaned directly out of a heavily dirty second-story window. She had entirely pointed the tiny plastic camera directly down toward the heavy gravel driveway below. She had completely undeniably captured an incredibly clear photograph of a heavy commercial delivery truck parked completely entirely outside the house, and completely entirely visible on the heavy metal bumper of the delivery truck, heavily illuminated by the bright morning sun, was a absolutely entirely readable commercial license plate. The heavily fierce, incredibly intelligent young bride had completely deliberately captured the absolute ultimate clue. Detective Holden immediately ran the plate numbers, entirely discovering the truck belonged to a long-closed, highly secluded rural boarding house miles away in the deep Ohio countryside. The massive, heavily armed state task force was finally completely zeroing in on Grace Holloway's absolute final, deeply terrifying location. The truth was entirely imminent, and the deeply heartbreaking conclusion to her unbelievable journey was only moments away from violently coming into the light. The massive, heavily armed state task force aggressively descended on the exact physical coordinates of the long-closed, highly secluded rural boarding house. The massive, decaying property was deeply hidden at the end of a heavily overgrown, deeply rutted dirt road, completely swallowed by the dense Ohio forest. It had entirely ceased operations in the early 2000s, sitting completely abandoned, quietly rotting in the damp Midwestern air for over 15 years. Detective Holden and his team violently kicked the heavy, completely swollen front doors open, their heavy tactical flashlights aggressively cutting through the profound, suffocating darkness. The interior of the massive house was a entirely terrifying time capsule of complete psychological isolation. The heavy, faded wallpaper was violently peeling in long, curling strips. The massive, dusty rooms were completely filled with abandoned, deeply broken furniture. Holden aggressively completely directed his forensic technicians to heavily tear the entire building apart. They completely pulled down the heavy ceiling panels, violently ripped through the thick, water-damaged drywall, and aggressively scoured every single dark closet. In a small, incredibly cramped bedroom located on the deeply isolated second floor, a state technician noticed something entirely completely subtle. One of the heavy, wide wooden floorboards completely located directly beneath a small, dirty window was slightly raised, its old iron nails completely entirely missing. Detective Holden knelt completely down in the thick dust. He carefully, entirely gently pried the heavy wooden board completely up with his gloved hands. Deeply entirely hidden in the dark, incredibly tight space between the heavy floor joists, was a small, entirely completely wrapped bundle of fragile paper. Holden carefully pulled the heavily tied bundle into the light. It was a massive, completely heartbreaking collection of deeply private, heavily folded handwritten letters. The state handwriting experts completely entirely confirmed the absolute reality within hours. Every single incredibly fragile letter had been entirely completely written by Grace Holloway. Detective Holden gently completely brought Nolan into the quiet precinct and placed the heavy, completely entirely beautiful letters on the metal table. Nolan wept completely openly, his tears violently spilling onto the incredibly familiar handwriting. Grace had spent her long, agonizing days completely secretly entirely writing to the husband she so profoundly loved, desperately documenting her terrifying reality, because she absolutely never entirely stopped believing he would completely find them. In those incredibly detailed, completely deeply devastating letters, Grace entirely completely explained the absolute, horrifying truth of her captivity. She had absolutely completely never been physically restrained. There were entirely no metal chains, no heavy padlocks, and completely no barred windows holding her inside the dark house. She had been entirely completely psychologically imprisoned by a massive, highly sophisticated web of terrifying lies. The older woman had deeply completely manipulated Grace's incredibly fierce, completely entirely beautiful empathy. The Phantom had aggressively entirely convinced Grace, and all the other highly vulnerable women, that a massive, highly corrupt network of dangerous police officers and wealthy politicians was actively hunting them. But the most completely terrifying, deeply agonizing lie was the one the older woman had entirely specifically used against Grace. She completely entirely told me that if I ever tried to run away, or if I ever entirely completely contacted you, her highly dangerous friends would violently murder you. Grace had heavily written in one of the incredibly fragile letters. I entirely completely stayed in the dark because I had to completely protect you. I am entirely completely pretending to follow her rules. I am heavily completely waiting for a safe opportunity to escape, but I am entirely terrified that if I make a single mistake, it will cost you your beautiful life. The completely suffocating, deeply heavy reality violently washed over Nolan. His beautiful, entirely completely selfless wife had entirely sacrificed her own physical freedom to fiercely protect his life. She had completely entirely endured a massive psychological nightmare, constantly heavily relocated, entirely stripped of her name, and entirely isolated by pure fear, all because she loved him entirely completely too much to risk his safety. Grace heavily repeatedly documented her desperate, incredibly brave plans to escape. She entirely completely explained how she had secretly entirely smuggled the disposable camera, taken the photograph of the delivery truck, and desperately, heavily completely tried to find a way to quietly reach the authorities without entirely triggering the older woman's completely imaginary violent network. As the massive, highly publicized media coverage of the Robert Sterling arrest and the rural boarding house discovery entirely saturated the national news, a deeply critical, absolutely massive breakthrough violently completely changed the investigation. A deeply elderly, highly quiet man completely entirely came forward to the state police, his memory violently entirely triggered by Grace's heavily broadcasted photograph. The man had been a rural delivery driver in the late 90s. He sat in the sterile interrogation room, heavily completely trembling as he recounted a deeply specific, entirely completely unforgettable morning in early 1999. I was entirely completely driving my heavy route near that abandoned rural boarding house, the elderly witness heavily explained, his voice completely cracking. A young woman suddenly aggressively ran completely out of the dense woods. She looked deeply exhausted, entirely completely terrified and incredibly thin. It was Grace. Holden aggressively, entirely leaned across the table, his heart violently completely pounding. She aggressively begged me to completely drive her to a major bus station in the next massive city. The witness wept, heavily completely consumed by a profound guilt. I completely offered to drive her directly to the local police station. I entirely completely told her I could help her. Why didn't you? Holden completely entirely demanded. Because she completely entirely panicked, the elderly driver cried. She violently begged me absolutely not to call the police. She completely entirely believed that innocent people would be completely violently harmed if anyone officially knew exactly where she was. She completely convinced me to simply drop her off quietly. I completely entirely let her walk into that massive bus terminal entirely alone. Following that massive, highly critical lead, the state task force aggressively, entirely shifted their entire investigation completely across the state line to the specific massive city the driver had completely named. They entirely completely knew Grace had survived into early 1999. She had finally entirely completely executed a massive, highly successful physical escape from the older woman's terrifying grip. Detective Holden aggressively completely audited the heavily archived, deeply restricted historical records of every single domestic support center and highly confidential legal aid office completely surrounding that specific urban bus terminal. After weeks of deeply exhausting, completely entirely agonizing dead ends, the state computer finally entirely completely registered a massive, highly tragic hit. In the early spring of 1999, a highly terrified, deeply completely exhausted young woman had quietly entirely walked into a free legal aid clinic in that massive city. She had completely entirely used a heavily falsified name, desperately completely asking a pro bono lawyer exactly how she could safely entirely reclaim a stolen identity without completely alerting a dangerous criminal network. It was Grace. She was entirely, completely, actively fighting her way back to her beautiful husband. But the deeply heartbreaking, completely devastating truth of the massive cold case entirely, completely shattered the state command center. Detective Holden entirely, completely discovered exactly why Grace had absolutely never made it home. The legal aid clinic had entirely, completely set up a highly confidential, deeply secure appointment for the young woman to completely officially begin the process of reclaiming her true name. But she absolutely, completely never arrived for that heavily scheduled appointment. Just days completely entirely before she could officially shatter the older woman's massive psychological hold and entirely completely tell the world exactly who she was. A massive, profoundly, completely, entirely unfair tragedy had struck. While heavily completely walking across a deeply dark, incredibly icy urban highway in a completely entirely unfamiliar city, the young woman had been tragically, entirely completely struck by a commercial vehicle in a massive traffic accident. Because she was completely entirely still carrying the heavily falsified identification forced upon her by the older woman, and because she completely entirely lacked any true physical connections in that massive city, the local authorities absolutely never completely connected the tragic accident to the highly publicized Grace Holloway missing persons case. She had deeply, entirely, completely lost her beautiful life while desperately, completely, entirely trying to fight her way back to the man she loved. For 16 incredibly long, profoundly, completely agonizing years, she had been entirely, completely, quietly buried in a beautiful, deeply peaceful municipal cemetery, officially completely listed in the state registry as an entirely unknown Jane Doe. The massive state crime laboratory aggressively completely exhumed the quiet grave. They heavily completely extracted the highly complex genetic material, entirely completely running a massive, highly advanced modern forensic genealogy test. The absolute final, entirely completely undeniable results were quietly handed to Detective Holden on a bright, highly crisp autumn morning. Holden slowly, entirely, completely drove to Grace Holloway's quiet suburban house. He walked heavily up the front steps, entirely, completely preparing to deliver the most profoundly heartbreaking, entirely beautiful truth a detective could absolutely ever speak. Nolan sat entirely, completely at his wooden kitchen table as Holden gently, completely, entirely explained the absolute conclusion of the massive, 18-year nightmare. The modern forensic DNA completely perfectly matched. Nolan completely, entirely collapsed into his hands, weeping with a massive, profoundly, entirely unmeasurable combination of absolute devastation and an incredibly fierce, deeply, completely beautiful pride. He finally, entirely, completely knew the absolute truth. His beautiful wife had absolutely never completely abandoned him. She had absolutely never simply walked away from their perfect, completely beautiful new marriage. She had spent nearly 2 incredibly agonizing, profoundly terrifying years desperately, completely, entirely searching for a safe way to finally bring herself home. She had entirely, completely fought a massive psychological war in the absolute dark. She had spent her deeply stolen time entirely, completely protecting highly frightened children, heavily, secretly comforting victims when the monster completely wasn't watching. She had entirely, completely written dozens of incredibly beautiful, highly profound letters she absolutely, entirely couldn't mail, completely, entirely documenting her massive, unshakable love for her husband. And when the state authorities heavily, completely returned Grace's few physical belongings that had entirely, completely been recovered from the tragic accident in 1999, Nolan completely broke down. Sitting entirely safely inside a small, highly protected evidence envelope was a completely familiar, incredibly tiny piece of delicate silver. It was the completely beautiful, highly specific silver pendant Nolan had given her completely on their wedding day. She had fiercely, completely, entirely held on to it until the absolute very last second of her beautiful life. The deeply, incredibly quiet town of Elmwood completely, entirely rallied around Nolan. The massive, deeply toxic shadow of public suspicion that had heavily, completely isolated him for 18 incredibly long years violently evaporated, completely replaced by a massive, profound outpouring of absolute awe and deeply heavy community grief for the young bride's incredible bravery. Nolan heavily, entirely, completely brought Grace home. He gently, completely buried her in a deeply beautiful, entirely peaceful local cemetery, located completely right on the edge of the sprawling Ohio woods she had once completely loved so much. The massive, completely terrifying mystery was finally, absolutely, entirely solved. The incredibly dangerous older woman and her highly wealthy benefactor had been entirely, completely exposed, their massive network of dark psychological manipulation completely destroyed forever by the sheer, absolute willpower of a young art teacher. On a deeply quiet, completely beautiful Sunday afternoon, Nolan walked heavily up the green hill of the cemetery. He stood completely, entirely, quietly in front of the highly polished, incredibly beautiful marble headstone that finally, permanently bore his wife's completely true name. He gently, entirely, completely reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small, highly glossy birthday party photograph. he had completely entirely found at that random estate sale. He entirely completely understood the massive, deeply profound magnitude of exactly what Grace had done. The birthday photograph had absolutely never completely been an accident. Grace had completely intentionally, aggressively entirely stepped directly into that specific camera frame on purpose. She completely entirely looked directly into the lens, completely pointing her hidden finger toward the edge of the world, because she entirely completely deeply knew that if she didn't survive the massive nightmare, she absolutely entirely had to completely leave a physical marker behind. She completely entirely knew that eventually, years completely entirely in the future, someone would heavily develop that forgotten film, and they might finally entirely completely realize she had absolutely never stopped entirely fighting to get back to the light. 18 completely incredibly long years after she vanished from that completely ordinary pharmacy parking lot, one entirely forgotten, heavily dusty photograph had violently completely broken the massive silence. It gave Grace Holloway her beautiful name back, completely entirely cleared the heavy, agonizing questions that had violently haunted her husband for nearly 2 decades, and finally, absolutely entirely completely brought a heartbreaking but profoundly complete answer to a beautiful family that had absolutely never, ever stopped believing.